let's get this training session started with something to think about. There are two types of people in the world, and these are the assets and the liabilities. I hope we all strive to be the assets in this world, but today we will focus only on the liabilities. Accounts payable and the related costs and expenses, to be exact. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so welcome to this training session on how to audit accounts payable and accrued expenses and the related costs and expenses through the performance of substantive testing procedures. We will divide this training session into two parts. In the first part, we will cover accounts payable and accrued expenses, and in the second part, we will briefly cover costs and expenses. Please note that for a more efficient audit, the audit of accounts payable and accrued expenses is best done in conjunction with the audits of inventory and costs and expenses, since all these accounts are linked with each other. So usually, dapat ang nag-audit ng accrued expenses and other payables, kung may inventory yung kliyente, dapat siya rin ang mag-audit ng inventory. That is the most efficient thing to do pag ganun yung klase ng clients natin. Or kung walang inventory, then dapat kung sino yung mag-audit ng accounts payable and accrued expenses, siya rin ang mag-audit ng costs and expenses. The auditing of inventory was tackled in a separate training session. In this regard, we will discuss today only the common substantive procedures for accounts payable and accrued expenses and costs and expenses. So we will not discuss inventories anymore. Let's see what our training objectives for this session are. At the end of this training session, I hope that you would have gained a basic understanding of accounts payable and accrued expenses and costs and expenses, learned about some of the common risks relating to accounts payable and accrued expenses and costs and expenses, learned the principal audit objectives in auditing accounts payable and accrued expenses, and the related costs and expenses as well, and finally, learned about the substantive audit procedures typically performed on accounts payable and accrued expenses and costs and expenses. This training will be conducted in the same order as these training objectives. So let's briefly talk about the accounts payable and accrued expenses first. For an effective and efficient audit, we must understand the account we are going to audit, or at least know something about the account before we perform any audit procedure on them. So let's discuss the account first. By the name itself, we would know already that accounts payable and accrued expenses are liabilities. Liabilities are the opposite of receivables. If receivables are amounts owed from debtors, liabilities are amount owed to creditors. Liabilities can be settled through the transfer of money, goods, or services. Liabilities can also be viewed as sources of the company's assets. For example, inventories were bought through the incurrence of liabilities, or cash was received from a loans payable. So nag-exist simultaneously yung asset and yung liability. Liabilities come in various forms. There are accounts payable, accrued expenses, deferred revenue, notes payable, bonds payable, loans payable, advances from related parties, taxes payable, customer deposits, warranty payable, provisions and contingent liabilities, and many more. For purposes of this training session, however, our discussions will focus only on the substantive audit procedures performed on accounts payable and accrued expenses. Auditing of other forms of liabilities, such as debts and related parties, is presented in other training sessions. So yung debts, natapos na natin, the related party, the auditing of related party transactions will be presented next week. Accounts payable, which is more commonly known as trade payable, is an amount due to vendors or suppliers for goods delivered to or services received by the company in the ordinary course of business that has not yet been paid for. The liability side of purchases of inventories on credit is charged to the trade payables account. Accrued expenses, on the other hand, is an accounting term used for expenses that have already been incurred and recognized by the company in its books, but have not been paid yet. Accounts payable and accrued expenses typically arise from past transactions, meaning the control over the goods or services has already passed to the company when the liability is recognized. So until the control over the goods or services has passed to the seller, no liability should be recognized in the books yet. Accounts payable and accrued expenses have three essential criteria, which are: 1, a present obligation; 2, a past transaction or event; and 3, a probable future sacrifice of economic benefits. So present, past, and future. So to sum up these three criteria, accounts payable and accrued expenses are present obligations that are owed to vendors for a past transaction or event, such as receipt of goods and services that will be settled in the future either by transfer of cash, goods, or services. So remember those three essential criteria: present, past, and future. The measurement of accounts payable and accrued expenses differs between full PFRS and PFRS for SMEs and small entities or SEs. Under full PFRS, accounts payable and accrued expenses are required to be initially measured at their fair value. Remember this kasi marami nagkakamali dito, especially when disclosing sa financial statements. But under PFRS for SMEs and SEs, these liabilities are required to be initially measured at their transaction price unless the arrangement constitutes in effect a financing transaction. Again, these differing accounting treatments for the same account requires that our accounting knowledge as auditor should always be up to date. So remember that iba yung sa PFRS, yung initial measurement sa PFRS, and sa SME. Sa PFRS, at fair value siya initially recognized. Sa PFRS for SMEs and SEs, initially recognized siya at transaction price. Accounts payable and accrued expenses are typically short-term in nature and thus are presented under the current liabilities section on the statement of financial position. So short-term in nature siya. But before we discuss the common risks associated to the account, let's briefly discuss the internal controls first over accounts payable and accrued expenses. Aside from the risk of understatement in payables, which we will discuss in a little while, there are other common risks related to accounts payable and accrued expenses, which could be mitigated by strong internal controls for the account. So before discussing the common risks on accounts payable and accrued expenses, let's briefly discuss first the basic internal controls that are typically implemented for the accounts payable function. Let's divide the basic internal controls into three general categories. One, obligation to pay controls. The second category is data entry controls. And the third category is payment controls. So let's briefly discuss each one of these. Let's start with obligation to pay controls. The controls under this category aim to ensure that all the accounts payable and accrued expenses of the company are verified. In this regard, there are typically four ways to verify the obligations to pay. These four ways are: 1, purchase order approval; 2, invoice approval; 3, three-way matching, and the fourth category or four way to verify the obligation to pay is duplicate payment search. Under purchase order approval, all purchases made or to be made by the company should be supported by a duly approved purchase order and purchase requisition form. Under invoice approval, the appropriate officer should authorize the supplier's invoices for payment. Under three-way matching, the accounts payable staff matches the details of the supplier's invoices with purchase orders and receiving documents. Finally, under the duplicate payment search, the accounts payable clerk reviews all the supplier's files and unpaid invoices files to identify and ensure that no duplicate invoices were paid. A common control that companies use to prevent double presentation of invoices for payment is to mark all paid invoices with the word paid or canceled. And as you can imagine, this manual searching for duplicate payments could be a tedious task if a company receives a lot of suppliers' invoices regularly. Let's now go to the next way to verify obligation to pay controls. And this is the data entry controls. The controls under this category aim to ensure that all valid supplier invoices are recorded in the books or are entered in the accounts payable system for payment. Several ways of data entry controls can be used by the companies, but we will discuss two of them, which are to record the payable after approval and to record the payable before approval. Under record after approval, the accounts payable clerk is required to verify first the approval of every supplier's invoice before recording or entering the same into accounts payable. So kailangan approve muna before i-post sa system. In contrast, under the record before approval, all received suppliers' invoices are recorded in the payable system immediately without verifying for approval first. So once na na-receive yung supplier's invoice, ipapasok ka agad sa system. So the next way to verify internal controls or payment obligation controls is this one, payment controls. The controls under this category aim to ensure that payments are made, since payment through checks is still the most preferred way of paying obligations due to the audit trail it provides. Our discussion of controls will focus on this payment type. One of the most important controls that a company should implement is the segregation of duties. This means that the person who prepares or generates the check is different from the person or persons signing such checks Thus, cross-checking is done on the issuance of checks. Another control regarding payments is to track the issuance of checks through their number sequence. All checks should be sequentially issued based on their numbers. Any missing check number should be fully accounted for to prevent or uncover possible theft or missing payment. Another common control for payment is to require dual signatories on checks. This means, at the very least, dual signatories on checks. This means that a check needs to be signed by at least 2 authorized officers of the company. Some companies even implement hierarchical signing authorizations, meaning signing thresholds are set. For example, up to a certain amount, the accounting manager and another senior level staff can sign the checks. When the amount goes up to another level, the senior level staff would have to be replaced by, say, the chief financial officer already. Up another level, the accounting manager needs to be replaced by the president, such that only the president and the CFO can sign on the check. So as you can imagine, performing all the tasks and controls we just discussed could be tedious, prone to human error, and even costly if done manually. Accordingly, for efficiency purposes and to reduce errors in manually recording suppliers' invoices, it is best for companies to use a computerized accounts payable system that can host all accounts payable documents and can perform tasks such as matching invoice data with account codes. Companies should consider using a computerized accounts payable system that can conduct all the tasks involved and can automatically identify duplicate invoice numbers or data, for example. A reliable computerized accounts payable platform can speed up the accounts payable processes, help prevent or reduce duplicate payments, prevent fraud, minimize human errors, and increase the accuracy of the function. I would like to point out that these are not all the controls that a company can implement over accounts payable and accrued expenses. These are just some of those controls. But whatever controls the company implements will affect the reliability of the recorded accounts payable balance and consequently the nature, timing, and extent of our audit procedures. So now that we have an idea, what are the typical or basic controls implemented for the accounts payable function, we can now discuss the common risks related to the account. The possibility of this risk occurring becomes high when the internal controls implemented for the accounts payable function is weak. So these are the common risks we will discuss. Intentional understatement of payables, payment to wrong vendors, fictitious vendors, and double payment to vendors. Let's briefly discuss each of these risks, starting with the intentional understatement of payables. Companies commonly tend to understate liabilities rather than overstate them because a highly leveraged company is not generally attractive to investors and creditors. For creditors, a high balance of payables may mean that the company is incapable of paying its liabilities on time, while for investors, a high balance of short-term liabilities may be considered an indicator of possible liquidity issues. So companies that desire to present better financial statements to their stakeholders may manipulate their liabilities by intentionally understating them by, for example, not performing proper cutoff of liabilities and expenses or intentionally not recording some of them. We must therefore ensure that proper auditing procedures are performed to address this risk of understating liabilities by companies. The next common risk pertains to payments made to wrong vendors. Payment to wrong vendors can occur for various reasons, such as lack of review or cross-checking of invoices and other related documents for payments, human error, and even negligence on the part of the accounts payable personnel. When the controls of the company are weak for accounts payable, payments made to the wrong vendor may not even be detected at all within the company, especially when the concerned employees are remiss of their duties. The wrong payment may be uncovered only until the correct vendor demands payment. So until maningil, hindi na-identify ng kliyente. Paying amounts to the wrong vendors can be a painful process because not many vendors will acknowledge that they were wrongly paid and thus return the money to the company. Bihira yung nagbabalik ng receipt na mali. Would the wrong vendor even know that they were wrongly paid, for example, when the amount they receive is different from the amount they billed? Some vendors may think that partial payment was only made when their billing is more than the amount paid. But let's say the supplier realized that the payment was made in error when they received more than what they billed. Do you think the supplier or creditor returned the excess payment? Probably not. They would likely just record the same as an overpayment that will be applied against their next billing. Accordingly, payment to wrong vendors, if rampant, or when the amount involved is significant, can negatively affect the company's cash flows as well. It is not only the return of wrongly paid amounts that can be an issue when it comes to payments made to the wrong vendors. The recording to the accounts payable ledger will also be affected since the payment will remain to have been applied to the correct vendor's account balance when it was not the same vendor who received the payment. Another risk associated to accounts payable and accrued expenses is payment to fictitious vendors. Ito naman fake na vendor. Yung isa, double payment. Payment to fictitious vendors is a fraud that can be committed due to lack of effective controls, especially relating to the segregation of duties. As we have mentioned earlier, segregation of duties requires that the approval of invoices for payments, preparation of checks, signing of checks, and recording to the books of accounts be performed by different personnel so that independent cross-checking of information can be performed. However, if all these functions are done by the same person, then this setup allows manipulation of payments. As an erring employee may create false invoices to pay and then pocket such payments, or may ask a colluding party to send fake invoices to the company, and then such erring employee and the colluding party pocket the payments. Moreover, overriding of controls can also allow for payments to fictitious vendors to occur. There had been an actual case in the past where it was the president of a medium-sized company who was found guilty of committing this fraudulent activity. The president had a colluding party send fictitious invoices to the company, which the president ordered its employees to pay without question, thus totally ignoring the company's protocol of checking invoices for payments. So the practice of overriding controls and payment to the fake vendor was discovered only after the company was bought by another entity. So kung hindi pa nabili yung company, hindi pa ma-check yung mga fake invoices na pinababayaran ng president. The last but not the least common risk relating to accounts payable that we will discuss is making double payments to vendors. Many vendors send a second or even a third copy of their invoices or billing statements if the first one has not been paid off quickly or immediately. In this scenario, a weak control for the accounts payable function may allow paying the same billing statements many times over. And if the internal controls are weak, then the possibility of the duplicate payments made being uncovered quickly may not even happen. However, let's say, for example, that the company was able to single out and identify the duplicate payment. Then similar with paying to wrong vendors, the possibility of refunding back the excess payment is almost nil. The vendor would again likely just keep the money and apply the excess payment to the next transaction with the company. This would likely be a minor issue if the company regularly or constantly transacts with the supplier. But what if the doubly paid purchase is a one-time or a very rare transaction for the company? In this case, the company will have to initiate a refund from the vendor, which could take some time, especially if the amount is significant. Accordingly, double payment of the same invoice can also negatively impact the company's cash flow, similar to making payments to the wrong vendors. So in summary, understatement in the account balance, payment to wrong vendors, double payment to vendors, and even fictitious vendors can arise when there is no proper review of payable transactions, such as payable setup, payment of payables, and or recording of payable transactions. Lack of proper review of payable transactions can result from weak controls, such as but not limited to the absence of segregation of duties, no review of payable postings, and or absence of regular reconciliation of payable balances with creditors. Whether the client uses a manual reporting system or a computerized system, we as auditors should always gain an understanding of the client's internal controls during the planning phase of the audit. We must ensure that we fully understand the controls, or lack of controls as the case may be, being implemented over accounts payable and accrued expenses, so that proper substantive procedures that can address the identified risks can be tailor-made by us for our clients. So remember that yung nasabi ko na in previous sessions, the effectiveness of our substantive testing procedures depends on the effectivity of the risk assessment process uh, we conducted during the planning phase of the audit. So let's now move on to the principal audit objectives. So now that we have gotten the common risks out of the way, let's discuss the principal audit objectives in auditing accounts payable and accrued expenses. There are 5 principal audit objectives in auditing this account. And these are those 5 audit objectives. Let's briefly discuss each one. The first audit objective is to determine that all accounts payable and accrued expenses on the balance sheet are real debts due to suppliers or other creditors of the entity for goods received or services performed. This audit objective addresses existence and occurrence. Maybe at first thought, many will think that there's a low risk for companies to record fictitious accounts payable and accrued expenses in their books. After all, a large balance of outstanding liabilities may be construed as not a good sign of financial health, as it could mean insolvency or illiquidity. And it may be true, because more often than not, it is the opposite that is typically more desired by a company. However, this does not mean that a company will have no more valid obligations in its book, no more invalid obligations in its books. Accordingly, as a sign of prudence, we as auditors should not immediately assess as low the risk of existence and occurrence on accounts payable and accrued expenses. We should consider first the internal controls implemented, including management's motivation over accounts payable and accrued expense transactions before we tag the account as low risk for existence and occurrence. For example, there are still many companies out there whose accounting records have not been attended to properly, probably because the focus of the management had been growing their businesses, thus forgetting in the process the record-keeping aspect of running the business. For these companies, certain liabilities that have already been settled may remain in the books as outstanding. These can usually be found in long outstanding accounts payable and accrued expense account balances. However, since the company finds it difficult to verify whether an account has already been settled or not, due to the messy state of their records, the company just typically opts to keep these questionable liabilities in its books in case demand for payment was made on the account. I think sa mga nag-audit, may mga kliyente na kayong may case na ganito, yung mga long outstanding liabilities na ayaw namang ipa-write off ng client because they believe na baka merong, although hindi nila alam kung kanino siya payable, or kung totoong outstanding pa yung liability na yon, ayaw nilang i-write off because they think na yung other side might claim or demand for payment for those liabilities. Aside from messy record keeping, however, accounts payable and accrued expenses may also be affected when the company tries to defraud its investors. For example, in the widely reported accounting scandal case of McKesson and Robbins, the company inflated its revenues and purchases of inventories through the creations of fictitious supporting documents such as sales and purchase invoices. The fake revenues and fake inventories consequently led to fake receivables and fake trade payables as well. In this regard, our audit procedures, therefore, should be able to address the assertions, existence, and occurrence on accounts payable and accrued expenses. The next audit objective is to ascertain that all accounts payable and accrued expenses owed by the entity at the balance sheet date are included on the balance sheet. I think among all the principal audit objectives that we will discuss, this objective, which addresses completeness and cutoff, is the most critical one that needs to be addressed in the audit of accounts payable and accrued expenses. As mentioned earlier, most companies would typically prefer to show lesser amounts of liabilities than overstate them. Many companies went bust because of too many liabilities that they couldn't pay for. Also, most of the widely reported accounting scandals that involved liabilities relate to the hiding of liabilities to present a fake strong financial position or increased net profit by not recording a portion of its accrued expenses or purchases in the proper accounting period. In this regard, the audit procedure that will be designed and executed for accounts payable and accrued expenses should be able to address the completeness and cut-off assertion. Another audit objective is to ascertain that accounts payable and accrued expenses are stated at the amounts owed at the balance sheet date. As we have mentioned earlier, the initial measurement for accounts payable and accrued expenses differs based on the accounting framework used by our clients. In this regard, not only should our substantive audit procedures on accounts payable and accrued expenses be designed to respond to the measurement assertion, but we as auditors should also always keep in mind the accounting framework our client uses before performing such procedures. So when we audit accounts payable and accrued expenses, make sure that we know the accounting framework our client uses, kung full PFRS ba siya, kung PFRS for SMEs ba, or PFRS for SEs. The next audit objective is to ascertain that the accounts payable and accrued expenses on the balance sheet represent obligations of the entity at the balance sheet date. As with any other transaction or event recorded by the company, the substantive audit procedures that we will perform should be able to ascertain that the accounts payable and accrued expenses represent amounts due from the company and not from any other party. So talagang due siya from the company. And the last principal audit objective that we will discuss is to ascertain that the accounts payable and accrued expenses are properly classified, described, and disclosed in the financial statements, including notes in conformity with prescribed accounting principle. As I have also mentioned earlier, except for certain rare circumstances, accounts payable and accrued expenses are typically classified as current liabilities. In this regard, along with ensuring the required disclosures and proper description of the account, the substantive audit procedures we will perform should be designed to also ascertain the proper classification of the accounts payable and accrued expenses account in the financial statements. Okay, so let's now talk about the typical substantive audit procedures performed on accounts payable and accrued expenses. As I have said earlier, we will only be discussing certain typically performed substantive audit procedures on this account, since in practice, the nature of the audit procedures to be performed on a particular client depends on the results of the risk assessment procedures we perform during the planning phase of the audit. And I just want to remind everyone that the risk assessment process does not stop sa planning stage. The risk assessment process is done all throughout the audit field work. So let's start with the first audit procedure, which is to obtain a detailed schedule of accounts payable by supplier that agrees with the general ledger. Just like with any other account balances that we audit, we also need to obtain a detailed schedule of accounts payable and accrued expenses, preferably by supplier. So the keyword is preferably, hindi naman siya kailangan laging ganito. But of course, this is the format that we prefer by supplier. Once we have the schedule, we should immediately mark it with the words prepared by client or PBC and the date we receive the schedule from the client. We should also check the clerical accuracy and mathematical accuracy of the schedule and verify that the total of such a schedule agrees with the amount in the general ledger. Of course, not to be forgotten, we should also immediately put a work paper index on the schedule for audit trail purposes as well. Here's a sample schedule of accounts payable by supplier totaling 1,950,379 pesos. Typically, for trade payables, the list would contain a lot more suppliers. So usually, marami to, kuminsan by the hundreds. However, for these training purposes, we will assume that the client has outstanding trade payables only to 9 vendors as of December 31, 20 CY. these vendors and the related amounts owed to them as of December 31, 20 CY are as follows. Make sure to take note of this because we will use this example in the in executing or discussing the next audit procedures. So the schedule shows that there's a trade payable balance to X Rizali Trading for 367,897 pesos, ABC Multi-Decor Limited for 37,650 pesos, Haley Retails for 567,451 pesos, Graphics NZ Inc. 1,265 pesos, Caleb Corporation 12,890 pesos, Metro Ziegler Corp for 457,890 pesos, Charlie Factory Inc. for 143,789 pesos. There's an amount due to LADX Trading for 350,890 pesos. And finally, there's an accounts payable due to Triple M Access Cooperative for 10,657 pesos. By the way, take note of the PM and PE presented here as well. The PM is 535,000. PM is the planning materiality. PE or the tolerable error is 350,000. And the summary of audit differences or the de minimis amounts is 10,700. For accrued expenses, so this is for accounts payable or the trade payables schedule. For accrued expenses, here's a sample schedule totaling 1,811,352 pesos. So same PM, PE, and SAD. Similar to accounts payable, the schedule of accrued expenses would usually contain a lot more items than what the schedule here presented. However, again, for purposes of this training, we will assume only that the client has these accrued expenses as of December 31, 20 CY. The accrued expenses consist of the following. The vendor is Verizon Telecom Inc. for 103,567, Northeastern Electric Cooperative for 356,890, 13th month pay for 389,768, withholding tax payable for 170,300 pesos. There's an accrued expense payable to Atlantic Water District for 120,789, NJ Advertising Corp for 467,908, Triple Y Security Agency for 78,654 pesos, XYZ Law Firm for 12,578 pesos, and finally, there's an accrued interest payable as of December 31, 20 CY amounting to 451,498 pesos. So keeping those schedules in mind, we will now go to the next substantive audit procedure, which is to select items for testing based on the audit team's sample plan. Based on the schedule of accounts payable and accrued expenses provided to us, we should then select items for testing based on the audit team's sample plan. For this particular case, let's assume that the audit team sample plan is to examine high-value items and, when necessary, select samples from the rest of the population. The high-value items that were identified by the team were those to be those balances that are equal to or more than the TE amount of 350,000 pesos. So ito yung in-identify nilang high-value key items. Any liability equal to or above 350,000 pesos. In this regard, the accounts payable we will have to select are the following for in vendors. The following accounts the accounts of the following vendors will be selected for testing based on the sample plan of the team. These are X Rizali Trading for 367,897 pesos. Haley Retails for 567,451 pesos. Metro Ziegler for 457,890 pesos. And the amount due to LADX Trading for 350,890 pesos. So ito yung mga above or equal to 350,000. For accrued expenses, the following high-value accrued balances will have to be selected for testing. And I think you can see clearly na it will have to be the amount due to Northeastern Electric Cooperative for 356,890 pesos, the 13th month pay, the amount due to NJ Advertising Corp, and the accrued interest payable for 451,498 pesos. The selected items for testing for accounts payable and accrued expenses amounting to 1,744,128 pesos and 1,666,064 pesos respectively accounted for 89% and 92% of their respective population already. So pag tinotal yung apat for accounts payable and yung apat for accrued expenses, they comprise majority of the population of the outstanding balance already. 89% for accounts payable and 92% for accrued expenses. In this regard, we will deem for purposes of this training that no additional items will be tested anymore unless it is found that the tested selected items are misstated. So since 89%, halos 11% na lang yung hindi matetest for AP, and then 8% lang yung hindi matetest for accrued expenses, we will assume na hindi na kailangang itest pa yung 11% at yung 8% na yon. Unless makita natin in the process of testing the 8 items na hindi reliable yung libro ng company, or it needs or we need to discuss or to obtain more samples from the untested population. For the selected accounts payable and accrued expense items, we will need to perform the next procedure, which is to inspect appropriate and sufficient pieces of evidence. So what we do is examine documents supporting subsequent payments for the liabilities made such as duly approved check vouchers, bank transfer slips, bank statements, and official or collection receipts issued by the vendor. So any valid and appropriate document supporting subsequent payments of the 8 transactions that we selected. For accounts payable with no subsequent payments made or no subsequent payments made at all, we need to examine the supporting source documents such as unpaid suppliers, invoices, and billing statements. Remember, our first priority is checking for the subsequent payment. Kapag lang walang subsequent payment na ginawa or masyadong maliit, let's say yung subsequent payment na ginawa, let's say ang balance is, ang total amount due is, let's say 1 million, ang binayad lang is 100,000, then we need to perform additional procedures in those cases. So, una muna subsequent payments, pag hindi tayo na-satisfy sa subsequent payments, saka pa lang tayo mag-e-examine nung source documents. In many cases, we also send confirmation requests for the selected trade payable balances. So usually sa trade payable lang natin ginagawa ang confirmation, but it doesn't mean na hindi tayo allowed na mag-send ng confirmation for accrued expenses. As long as the team deems it appropriate and necessary to send confirmation for accrued expenses. So walang nagpo-prohibit sa team from sending confirmation to accrued expense payable balances. However, I would just like to reiterate that similar to receivables, because the confirmation response rate for accounts payable in the Philippines is not high, we always consider performing immediately the alternative procedures while waiting for the vendor responses. When I say alternative procedures, I refer to the examination of subsequent payments and/or source documents as we have just discussed. I would like to reiterate what I keep on saying in other training sessions, which is we cannot examine documents on a sampling basis because we are already testing selected items only. This means that we should be able to verify the full outstanding balance of each of the selected items for testing. For example, if an account balance is supported by, say, 5 suppliers' invoices, then we should examine all 5 invoices and not one less. So, kunwari, yung amount due kay ABC Corp is supported by, it consists of, let's say, 10 invoices kasi marami tayong binili sa kanya, and all the purchases were covered by, or the outstanding purchases were covered by 10 invoices. Hindi pwede nating sabihin na yung dalawa lang ang what you call this, ang i-examine natin. Tapos let's say lang yung dalawa, wala tayong nakitang difference from what is recorded in the books. Hindi natin pwedeng sabihin na okay na tong dalawa, hindi ko na itetest yung 8. Parang ganon. It doesn't, the audit should not work that way. Bawal ang sampling within a sample. Kasi sample na nga yung tinetest natin, bawal na isample pa yung sample na yon. So let's take this audit case to help us understand more about confirming accounts payable. Let's read the case together. Due to a natural catastrophe that destroyed some of the client's files and documents, the team decided that confirmation of accounts payable would be done to determine due to the amount due to the client's biggest supplier as at the balance sheet date. The client provided the auditors an estimated amount of what they believe they owe their biggest supplier as at the balance sheet date. The junior auditor then requested their client to prepare the accounts payable confirmation similar to what they did for the receivable confirmation request. This means a positive confirmation where the supplier can simply agree or disagree with the outstanding balance presented on the confirmation request. Meaning yung pinadala nilang confirmation request, nakalagay na yung amount na due to the vendor. Ang kailangan na lang gawin ng vendor is to agree or disagree with the amount. So the question is the junior auditor correct in asking the client to prepare their accounts payable confirmation, similar to the receivable confirmation, which we just discussed, my amount and positive confirmation? In this case, my suggested response is no. However, so for me, the junior auditor is not entirely correct in requesting the client to prepare the confirmation in such a way. However, there is a big but here, because there is nothing wrong when the confirmation request for accounts payable shows the amount of the payable recorded in the books. Wala namang mali dun sa ginawa nung, I mean, walang, no one, or no accounting standard prohibits yung sending ng confirmation for accounts payable with amount na nakapresent yung amount. Wala namang ganun. So, may point din naman yung auditor. I mean, hindi nagmali yung auditor in that way. As we have discussed earlier, the risk in accounts payable and liabilities in general is the risk of understatement in the balance of such account. Companies would rather show less amounts of liabilities than more of them to present better financial health. Accordingly, when sending confirmation requests to suppliers, we as auditors should try to maximize the result of such confirmation activity by addressing this risk of an understatement as well. In this regard, the confirmation request for accounts payable is typically prepared to be a blank confirmation, meaning the amount due to the vendors as at the cutoff date is left blank for the vendor to fill in. Yung vendor ang mag-fill up no amount. This is because the likelihood that a vendor will intentionally indicate an understated amount due to them is very low. It should be noted that for receivables, the amount due from the customer is typically indicated on the confirmation request because if left blank, a dishonest customer may indicate an understated amount due from them as at the cut-off date. However, I would like to point out that it is not mandatory for the confirmation for accounts payable to be always blank as to the amount due to the vendor. It is still up to the professional judgment of the engagement team on how they would confirm the accounts payable. For example, if the auditors deem the controls over the recording process of liabilities to be strong, and therefore the recorded liabilities can be relied upon, then whether an amount is presented or not on the confirmation request would not matter much. In this case, however, where the accounting records and documents had been lost, I think it would be best if a blank confirmation request be sent for accounts payable and accrued expenses. We can also request the vendor to attach documents such as a statement of accounts to support the amount they will put on the confirmation. So kasi since nawala yung mga files ng company, it is preferable, in my opinion, to send a blank confirmation request to the vendor kasi wala namang documents din na may maipipresent yung company to us. So parang in effect, magre-rely tayo doon sa documents nung the vendor. The only downside to sending blank confirmation is the fact that some vendors may not be open to responding immediately or responding at all to a confirmation request where they had to put the effort into answering. It is always easier for a confirmation receiver or recipient to respond if they only have to agree or disagree with the amount presented on the confirmation request. So sometimes kasi yung mga vendors ayaw nilang nagsusulat pa sila yung magsusulat ng amount. Gusto nila agree or disagree lang. So, but we have to still keep on or to make sure na yung type of confirmation that we will request from the creditors will address yung risk or yung objective natin in sending out those confirmation requests. I hope that's clear to you. Another very important procedure we conduct on accounts payable and accrued expenses is to perform a search for unrecorded liabilities for the period from the balance sheet date to a date on or near the end of our field work. For audit efficiency, testing for subsequent payments and or source documents of selected accounts payable and accrued expenses should be done simultaneously with the search for unrecorded liabilities procedure. As mentioned earlier, the risk on liabilities is for companies to understate them rather than overstate them. Accordingly, to address the risk, auditors must perform what is called a search for unrecorded liabilities procedure, which is one of the most important audit procedures for liabilities. Actually, pag nagre-review ako ng work papers for liabilities, itong unang-una kong hinahanap. Searching for unrecorded liabilities means looking for purchases or expenses that should have been recorded by the company as at the cut-off date, but has not done so. This search is done by looking at the payments made by the company after the balance sheet date, examining the payment documents and related invoices for significant amounts, and then ensuring that those subsequent payments for purchases made or expenses incurred within the period under review were properly recorded as part of the accounts payable and accrued expenses schedules or ledgers as at the balance sheet date. So as the term implies, naghahanap tayo ng mga unrecorded liabilities. That's the purpose of this particular audit procedure or audit step. Because nga of the possible understatement in liabilities, we take the initiative to look and find for any unrecorded liabilities that the client may either intentionally or unintentionally not recorded. So to help you further understand how a search for unrecorded liabilities is done, let's try to work on this sample case. Just to remind you again, search for unrecorded liabilities is best done in conjunction with our examination of documents for selected accounts payable and accrued expenses for testing. Remember kanina, sabi natin, yung mga na-select nating apat, 8 or 4 for AP and 4 for accrued expenses, sabi natin we test for subsequent payments. So since search for unrecorded liabilities also involve looking at subsequent payments, we should, for audit efficiency, para mas maging efficient yung audit, ginagawa natin to ng sabay. As much as possible, we do yung alternative procedures for selected items for testing with the search for unrecorded liabilities procedure. So let's say, based on your review of the disbursements made by the company in January of the following year or 20 FY, you noted that the following payments made to the selected vendors for testing and subsequent payments to be above or equal to your testing scope of 350,000. So let's say, ito yung subsequent payments na ginawa nung company na tinetest natin kanina for AP and accrued expenses. So these are the subsequent payments made. So on January 6, 20 FY, the company paid Northeastern Electric Cooperative for the 20 CY electricity for 356,890 pesos. On January 5, the company paid X Rizali Trading for 20 ZY inventory purchases for 145,200 pesos and 222,697 pesos. Also on January 5, the company paid ABC Banking Corp for 20 CY interest on loans for 450,000 pesos. So may binayaran siyang interest. On January 8, 20 FY, the company paid LADX Trading for 20 CY inventory purchases for 350,890 pesos. And then on January 10, 20 FY, the company paid Haley Retails for 20 CY inventory purchases for 367,890. By the way, FY is following year. And then the company paid NJ Advertising for 375,000 pesos for an advertising expense in 20 CY for the same amount. On January 11, 20 FY, the company paid West Central Broadband for 20 CY internet services for 352,567 pesos. And finally, on January 13, 20 FY, the company paid X Rizali Trading for 20 FY, then na purchases, inventory purchases for 351,346 pesos. So to perform a search for unrecorded liabilities and the alternative procedures on the selected vendors and accrued liabilities for testing simultaneously, since we said na for efficiency, dapat sabay natin siyang ginagawa, what we do is, we will need to compare the subsequent payments made to the outstanding accounts payable balance as of December 31, 20 CY. So we have the outstanding balances that we selected for testing earlier, and then we compare it with the subsequent payments made the following year. Please note that for this case purposes, we have limited the search for unrecorded liabilities to obligations amounting to 350,000 pesos and above only. So that's why konti lang yung pinapakita nating subsequent payments, kasi ang hiningi lang natin sa kliyente for our testing purposes and for this training session is any payment lang, subsequent payment equal to or above 350,000. So let's discuss and break down the result of the comparisons made. The first is this electricity, is the payment made to Northeastern Electric Cooperative. The outstanding accrued expense as of December 31, 20 CY to Northeastern Electric Cooperative for electricity consumed in 20 CY amounting to 356,890 pesos was fully paid in January 20 FY. So binayaran siya. So we can conclude that this particular accrued expense was a valid obligation as of December 31, 20 CY and was also recorded at the appropriate amount. So walang difference doon sa naka-accrue na liability to Northeastern Electric Cooperative and doon sa subsequent payment made. So essentially, ang concept na to is, ang sinasabi natin, hindi magbabayad. Bakit sinasabi natin na valid obligation siya kung mayroong subsequent payment? Kasi wala namang company na magbabayad nang wala naman siyang utang. Walang magka-cash out nang wala naman siyang babayaran. So yun yun. So parang lumalabas kung merong outstanding payable at binayaran subsequently, that means valid obligation talaga yung liability na yon. So the next item is the outstanding accounts payable as of December 31, 20 CY due to X Rizali Trading for inventory purchase in 20 CY amounting to 367,897 pesos was fully paid in 2 tranches. So yung outstanding balance, yung AP trade as of December 31, 20 CY for 367,897 binayaran in 2 tranches. One is for 145,200 pesos and the other one is 222,697 pesos. So pag tinotal mo yung dalawang yan, it will total to 367,897 also. So walang difference. So we can also conclude that this accounts payable was also a valid obligation as of December 31, 20 CY and was also recorded at the appropriate amount. What about the accrued interest? The balance of accrued interest as of December 31, 20 CY was 451,498 pesos, but the creditor bank only debited the amount of 450,000 pesos or a difference of 1,498 pesos, which at first glance appears to be an overstatement in the accrued interest balance. So, 451,000 ang nasa libro and yet ang binayaran lang or ang dinebit lang sa kanya ng bangko or ng creditor bank niya is only 450,000 pesos. So parang may overstatement na lumalabas na 1,498. However, since the difference is too small and even below our SAD threshold of 10,700 pesos, remember na yung SAD natin kanina is 10,700 pesos, we can forego investigating the difference and conclude that the accrued interest payable of 451,498 pesos is fairly stated as of December 31, 20 CY. Remember na ang purpose natin is just to give an opinion as to the fairness of the financial statements. Hindi naman accuracy ang term na ginagamit natin. Kung fairly presented lang yung financial statements. So kung may mga difference like this, it shouldn't affect our opinion. The next item is the payment made to LADX Trading. In this case, yung outstanding liability was paid in full, subsequently also same amount, so walang difference. So we can also conclude that this AP accounts payable trade is valid as of December 31, 20 CY. The payment to Haley Retails as of December 31, 20 CY for inventory purchases amounting to 567,451 pesos was partially paid only in the amount of 367,890 pesos in January 20 FY. Ito naman kulang ang binayad kasi yung outstanding balance is 561,451. Ang ibinayad lang subsequently na nakita natin is 367,890 only. Accordingly, in this case, we will need to examine the source documents such as suppliers' invoices, receiving documents, and or billing statements supporting the amount of 199,561 pesos to enable us to conclude about the propriety of the total accounts payable balance due to Haley Retails of 561,451 pesos as of December 31, 20 CY. This is an example of what I mentioned earlier na bawal ang sampling within a sample. Because Haley Retails is already a sampled item, hindi natin pwedeng sabihin na yung 367,000 is enough para makapag-conclude tayo na tama yung 567,000. We have to test the whole 567,000. And since ang subsequent payment is only 367,890, that means we will need to examine the source documents or the supplier's invoices for the remaining unpaid balance of 199,561 para mabuo natin yung 567,451 pesos para may conclude natin na tama or valid yung 561,451 pesos. Dapat 100% siyang ini-examine. The same with Haley Retails. The balance of accrued expenses to NJ Advertising Corp as of December 31, 20 CY was only partially paid in the amount of 375,000 pesos in January 20 FY. So pareho siya, hindi fully paid. Accordingly, we will need to examine the source documents such as the supplier's invoices or billing statements supporting the unpaid amount of 92,908 pesos to enable us to conclude about the propriety of the accrued expense balance due to NJ Advertising Corp of 467,908 pesos as of December 31, 20 CY. So pareho yung kay Haley Retail sa kay NJ Advertising, we have to fully account for the outstanding balances of 567,000 at yung 467,000. Hindi enough yung subsequent payments lang. And then, we noted that the company made a payment of 352,000 567 pesos in 20 FY to West Central Broadband for internet service provided in 20 CY, which was recorded as a debit to communication expense and a credit to the cash account in 20 FY. So nakita natin yung entry niya for this was a debit to internet expense or communication expense for 352,567 and a credit to cash. But since the service was provided to the company in 20 CY, this amount should have been recorded as an outstanding obligation as of December 31, 20 CY. Pero yung internet expense, when we look at the supporting documents, nakita natin na the service was for 20 CY, and yet na-record siya as expense in 20 FY. Therefore, this is a sample of an unrecorded liability that we should record in the books as of December 31, 20 CY. Remember, wala si West Central Broadband sa list natin ng items for testing. Hindi siya naka-record as liability as of December 31, 20 CY. So we need to propose an adjustment to recognize this or to push back yung recording nitong West Central Broadband as a liability as of December 31, 20 CY. So what the company has to do is record this as a liability as of December 31, 20 CY and then reverse yung payment nila, yung recorded expense nila in 20 FY. Finally, a subsequent payment for 151,346 pesos was also made to ex-Rizali Trading for inventory purchase in 20 FY. This obligation was not included in the outstanding balance due to such supplier as of December 31, 20 CY. But since the purchase is for 20 FY already, then it is rightly recorded in the books of the company as a 20 FY transaction, and therefore no need to perform any other procedure on this account. So this one, properly recorded siya as a 20 FY transaction kasi yung purchases niya is for 20 FY naman talaga. But we should also not forget that there are two sampled items for testing for which no subsequent payment has been made yet. These are the accounts due to Metro Ziegler Corp for 457,890 pesos. So these are the outstanding liabilities for which no subsequent payment was noted. And the accrued 13th month pay for 389,768 pesos. So what should we do with these two accounts na walang subsequent payments? For the Metro Ziegler Corp accounts payable balance as of December 31, 20 CY, we will need to inspect the source documents such as suppliers' invoices, receiving documents, and or billing statements to verify whether the obligation is valid and recorded in the appropriate amount. So since walang subsequent payments, then we should examine yung source documents, kung paano siya na-set up. Basically, yung pag-set up nila, documents to set up this liability. As to the accrued 13th month pay, we should investigate this amount further since the 13th month benefit is usually paid before the end of the year. Di ba yung 13th month pay, usually November pa nga yung iba, binibigay na yan. Accordingly, we will need to discuss this payable with the client first to understand why the amount remained outstanding at the end of the year. Kasi most likely, pag may naiiwan na 13th month pay, overstatement siya or invalid obligation siya. Kasi everyone needs the 13th month pay, di ba? Sa Pilipinas especially, kasi ginagamit natin yan for the holiday. So lahat tinatanggap yan. And lahat, actually nga, di ba, may clamor pa nga palagi na ibigay yan earlier. So, kung may naiiwan na accrued 13th month pay, at the end of the year, dapat kine-question natin yung validity nung liability na yon. So, we will need to ask the client first why the amount remained outstanding at the end of the year. We will then need to perform procedures. Kung ano may sabihin ng kliyente, we will need to perform procedures to substantiate the client's explanation and to verify the appropriateness of the amount recorded. So, depende yun sa kung ano man yung explanation ng client, we have to assess kung plausible ba yung sinasabi ng kliyente. Or if necessary, we need to perform procedures to substantiate yung explanation na binigay ng client. Just like we will discuss this later, yung kung paano i-substantiate yung explanation ng kliyente. So, that is how a search for unrecorded liability is performed. I hope you got this because, as I said, this is one of the most important, if not the most important, substantive audit procedure for accounts payable and accrued expenses. Actually, nung nasa US ako, halos ito lang yung makikitang procedure sa accounts payable, search for unrecorded liabilities lang. That's how important search for unrecorded liabilities is. So, even ako, I think sa mga na-review ko ng work papers, ito yung pag nakarating ako sa accounts payable and accrued expenses, this is the first audit, yung result nito ang unang-una kong hinahanap sa work papers or kung nagawa ng team yung search for unrecorded liabilities because this is one thing na dapat this is one procedure na dapat ginagawa at all times, whether low risk, high risk, or kung ano man yung client natin, yung assessment natin for accounts payable and accrued expenses. This is one of those procedures na dapat constant siyang ginagawa. In any types of client, lagi siyang ginagawa for accounts payable and accrued expenses. So the next audit procedure we will discuss is to test the cutoff of liabilities. So forming part of the search for unrecorded liabilities activity is verifying whether purchases cutoff procedures were made by the company. This purchase cutoff procedure should be done in conjunction with the audit of inventories. I think if you were able to attend or at least siguro panood niyo yung video on regarding sa training regarding sa auditing ng inventories, then this particular procedure was also tackled in that particular training video. As you may remember, one of the primary procedures highlighted in the training video for auditing inventory is the performance of cut-off procedures, since such activity can uncover unrecorded or misstated inventory and accounts payable balances. For example, we may uncover unrecorded inventory in transit and unrecorded liability as at the cutoff date when checking for purchase documents. Sometimes, madalas ito, actually, yung mga inventories in transit hindi nare-recognize sa libro. We may find inventories that are in transit to the company's warehouse as of the balance sheet date, but which the company failed to recognize as inventory as of the cutoff date because the company ordinarily records inventories upon receipt only. So sometimes may mga companies sa pag hindi nila natanggap or hindi nakarating sa warehouse nila, hindi nila nire-recognize na inventory yon, and so the related liability hindi rin nila nire-recognize. However, if the term is FOB shipping point, then the risk and rewards or control over the inventories would have already transferred to the company upon shipment. So kahit hindi pa, on the way pa lang yung inventory, since FOB shipping point siya, therefore dapat nire-recognize na siya nung client natin as their own inventories in transit, and the related liability should also be recognized. Accordingly, in cases like this, an adjusting entry to recognize the inventory in transit and the related accounts payable should be made in the company's books as at the balance sheet date. The next audit procedure is to review the accounts payable accounts in the general ledger voucher register, and cash disbursements journal, and investigate any unusual items. To address the risk of intentional manipulations or mistakes in recording liabilities, we scan and review the accounts payable and accrued expense postings made to the general ledger, voucher register, disbursements journal, and similar records to note for unusual items such as payables with whole number amounts, postings made on a Sunday or holiday, unusual payees, etc. Should unusual items be identified, such matters should be investigated. It should be noted that this review of unusual liability items can also be done in conjunction with the journal entries testing activity that is required to be performed under Philippine standards on auditing. But the journal entries testing procedures will be discussed in separate training session. So, actually, kung napapansin nyo, maraming mga procedures na dapat ginagawa in conjunction with the procedures for other accounts as well. So, like this, yung cutoff, yes, yung search for unrecorded liabilities, dapat it is best na ginagawa siya simultaneously with yung testing natin ng selected items for testing. And yung mga ganitong search for unusual items or procedures to note for unusual items, pwede natin itong gawin in conjunction naman with the journal entries testing. Another audit procedure is to request vendor statements for the largest accounts and request the client to reconcile the statements and investigate explanations for significant or unusual reconciling items. So we also compare selected outstanding vendor billing statements at the end of the year with the balances recorded in the books to verify whether payables are properly recorded by the client. So this one is more on controls ang tinitingnan natin. If differences are noted, we should request the client to reconcile such differences and consider investigating further if deemed necessary. The final audit procedure we will discuss in this training session about AP, accounts payable, and accrued expenses is to, before we move on to cost and expenses, auditing cost and expenses, is to compare the number of days purchases in accounts payable with prior years and investigate any unusual fluctuations. And then test the contractual maturities of financial liabilities and also test the aging of payables as deemed necessary. Some people, and accountants even actually, usually associate the word aging with receivables. So parang pag sinabing aging, automatic ang naiisip natin receivables. In reality, aging is done for payables also. The aging of payables is an essential tool in evaluating a company's liquidity. Public companies and other big companies use the accounts payable ratio as one of their primary KPIs because it shows how fast the companies can pay their vendors. A high accounts payable turnover ratio indicates short-term liquidity for a company, thus increasing its credit worthiness. For us auditors, verifying the proper aging of payables is especially important for companies with going concern issue. This is because a company with a going concern issue may intentionally manipulate the age of their payables to improve their credit worthiness and possibly attract investors along the way. So ito yung piniprevent natin or we hope na madidetect ng audit procedures natin, yung manipulation nung age nung payables. Please note that under PFRS 7, Financial Instruments Disclosure, companies are required to disclose, among others, the contractual maturities of their financial liabilities. The aging of payables and contractual maturities are not necessarily the same, but similar. Aging is essentially that, the age of the company's payable. So, magkaiba sila pero similar. Contractual maturities, on the other hand, essentially pertain to maturity time bonds, that is, the expected cash outflows, when the expected cash outflows are expected to occur for the financial liability. So, magkaiba sila, parang what do you call this? Marami kasi nako-confuse sa age ng receivable saka yung contractual maturity. So, ang contractual maturities is when the companies expect na yung cash flows nila, that they will have a cash outflow for those liabilities. So, parang, in essence, parang age na rin. Kasi kung yung company, pina-follow niya yung age ng receivables to paying, then parang nagiging parang pareho sila kasi yung kung ano yung age ng payable, yun din yung kung kailan niya babayaran. Pero for some companies kasi hindi gano'n ang nangyayari. Kung minsan masyado ng old yung receivables, and yet inuuna nilang bayaran pa yung latest na mga na-incur nilang liability. So yung maturity, yung cash outflow maturity, yung maturity time band nila for those liabilities nagche-change, nagiging magkaiba for aging and dun sa contractual maturities as required by PFRS 7. Medyo confusing siya pero but that is essentially yun. So yung age ng payable, yun talaga yung age niya, gano'n na siya katagal sa libro. Whereas yung contractual maturities is kailan nila babayaran, ini-expect na bayaran yung liabilities na yon. In this regard, we must check the reasonableness of the aging of accounts payable as deemed necessary and the contractual maturities of financial liabilities disclosed in the financial statements. Remember, anything na nilagay ng kliyente sa financial statements dapat tinitingnan natin, including these contractual maturities and age of receivables. Please note that the audit team should always assess properly when it is best to verify the aging of payables or determine whether other more appropriate procedures are needed to address the risk of liabilities based on the circumstances of their client. So that would be the last audit procedure we will discuss for accounts payable and accrued expenses. But I would just like to reiterate that the substantive audit procedures we discussed today for accounts payable and accrued expenses are not all inclusive or exhaustive. The substantive audit procedures that we perform should be tailored to the needs and circumstances of our clients. Accordingly, it is possible that not all of the procedures we discuss will be performed by an audit team, or that other procedures not discussed but which the audit team believed to be necessary to address the specific risk on their client will be performed. So either gagawin lahat itong procedures na diniscuss natin, or some lang, or meron pang iba na hindi natin diniscuss na the team may believe na dapat nilang gawin based on the risk na na-identify nila during the planning phase of the audit. So that's the end of accounts payable. But before we move on to costs and expenses, let's cap off or complete our discussion on the substantive testing of accounts payable and accrued expenses by discussing some of the common issues. So tapos na tayo sa substantive procedures, let's just discuss some of the common issues that are encountered in auditing the account. These are the one is no confirmation replies received or late receipt of reply. So ito yung mga issues na na-encounter natin during our audit of accounts payable and accrued expenses. So the first one is no confirmation replies received or late receipt of replies. Another issue or audit issue is sampling within a sample. Lagi yan. Madalas, hindi malagi but madalas nangyayari. and no reconciliation or late reconciliation of subsidiary ledger balance with the general ledger balance. I would like to point out that these issues and audit deficiencies are not exhaustive. Other issues may come up during the course of our audit of accounts payable and accrued expenses. But let's briefly discuss each one before we move on to costs and expenses. The first one is no confirmation replies received or late receipt of replies. When the team decides to send confirmation requests to vendors to validate the accounts payable balances, receiving confirmation replies on or before the end of the audit field work commonly becomes an issue because based on past experiences, not many vendors or suppliers reply immediately to confirmation requests here in the Philippines. Dito kasi sa Pilipinas, bihira or matagal mag-reply yung mga pinapadala natin ng mga confirmation requests. Accordingly, auditors are compelled to perform alternative procedures such as examining subsequent payments and vendor invoices and billing statements while waiting for the confirmation replies, if any, to come in. So, hindi naman natin pwede kasi na hintayin talaga yung confirmation reply kasi meron tayong timetable sa pag-audit. So, para makasave ng oras, once we send the confirmation request out, ang suggestion is to perform immediately the alternative procedures kasi parang ang walang kasiguruhan yung pagbalik nung reply, either on time or kung magre-reply man at all yung supplier. The next is sampling within a sample. As mentioned in the substantive testing training video on receivables, sampling within a sample is a no-no. As auditors, hindi siya pwede. As auditors, we cannot select supporting documents to examine for an item that is already a sample. For example, if you are examining supporting documents for a sampled vendor A's outstanding accounts payable balance, and such balance is supported by 50 vendors' invoices in small amounts, then you should examine all of 50 invoices and not one less. Hindi tayo pwedeng tamarin at sabihin natin, itong 50, 10 lang yung i-check ko. Itong 50 invoices, 10 lang i-check ko. Hindi pwedeng ganon. Kung 100 invoices ang nakasupport doon sa isang amount, then you have to examine all of the 100 invoices. You have to ask the client for all of the 100 invoices. Hindi pwedeng sabihin ng client, ito lang yung available, ito na lang 10 ang tingnan mo. Hindi pwedeng ganon. And finally, no reconciliation or late reconciliation of subsidiary ledger balance with the general ledger balance. Some companies do not reconcile their accounts subsidiary ledger balance with the general balance or reconcile the two sets of books only until the auditors request them to do so. So may mga kliyente naman na talagang hindi nagre-reconcile ng SL with their GL. So, and then pag nalang dumating yung auditor, sa kanila malalaman na may difference pala yung SL nila sa yung GL. Due to the lack of regular reconciliation process, some clients take a lot of time reconciling the differences. This consequently delays the completion of the audit. So, pag meron tayong nakitang mga ganitong cases sa kliyente natin, dapat prior pa lang to the start of the fieldwork, dapat sinasabihan na natin yung kliyente na before we come in, dapat reconcile na yung SL nyo. Otherwise, hindi tayo papasok. Because meron tayong timetable na sinusunod. So actually, that's the end of our discussion on accounts payable and accrued expenses. So if you will have any question about any of the things we discussed, feel free to put it in the chat box and then we'll discuss them later. Now, welcome to part 2 of this training session where we will discuss how to audit costs and expenses. So, pinagsama ko yung costs and expenses kasi very brief lang ang magiging discussion natin for costs and expenses. I would like to emphasize again that this training for costs and expenses focuses on certain substantive testing procedures only. Accordingly, other substantive procedures may be performed depending on the results of the risk assessment process during the planning stage for our clients. This training will be very brief since the audit of costs and expenses is connected to the audit of the related balance sheet accounts, which we already discussed in detail in other training courses. Kasi yung mga P&L accounts actually, uh, nanggagaling sila or they result from yung transactions involving the balance sheet account. So since um, dinidiscuss natin in detail yung how to audit the balance sheet accounts, therefore yung audit ng costs and expenses will be uh, very brief. So I would like to reiterate at this point that for more efficient audit of costs and expenses is best done in conjunction with the audits of inventory and accounts payable and expenses, since all these accounts are linked with each other. This training for auditing the training for auditing inventory is presented on a separate video. So let's begin learning the common risks associated to costs and expenses. You may notice that the common risks associated with costs and expenses are all connected to the related balance sheet accounts. Here are some of those common risks we will briefly discuss. You may also want to refer to the training session we conducted on inventories. Again, this list is not all-inclusive. The first common risk is the intentional understatement of expenses resulting from reduced liabilities. Another is fictitious expenses. Another risk is improper costing of inventories relating to improper cost of sales, resulting to improper cost of sales. And finally, improper costing of assets subject to amortization. So let's start with our discussion with the first common risk, which is the understatement of expenses resulting from reduced liabilities. As mentioned during our discussions about auditing accounts payable and accrued expenses, companies commonly tend to understate liabilities rather than overstate them. So basically, to understate accrued liabilities, companies may not properly record the related expenses or purchases for accounts payable as the case may be. Not only will the financial position of the company look healthier due to understated short-term liabilities, but their statement of income will also show a higher net profit due to lower costs and expenses, making the financial statements appear more attractive to investors and creditors. Please note that this risk could be the other way around as well. That is, it is the understatement of expenses that is intentional and the liabilities just become understated as a result. It all depends on the motivation and priority of the management. Is it to present a better profit or loss statement or a better statement of financial position? Regardless of the true intention of management, the risk is always that both expenses and liabilities could be understated. The next common risk is fictitious expenses. In cases where fraud is likely involved, some companies may intentionally inflate their expenses to save on, say, taxes. A dishonest employee who was given advances for liquidation may also charge fictitious or invalid expenses to the company when liquidating their advances. There had also been cases where employees charge personal expenses to their company. In other words, fictitious expenses can come from various sources. So this is something we should always be alert for, yung mga fake na expenses. Another common risk is the improper costing of inventories resulting in improper cost of sales. Cost of sales can be misstated due to improper costing of inventories since the cost of sales is computed as beginning inventory balance plus purchases during the year less ending inventory balance. So any error in the costing of inventory can affect the accuracy of the amount of cost of sales. So, pag mali yung costing ng inventory, most likely or definitely yung cost of sales then will be erroneous as well. So we have to make sure that we audit out the inventory account properly. The last common risk we will discuss is the improper costing of assets subject to amortization or depreciation. When assets that are subject to amortization or depreciation, such as fixed assets, prepaid expenses, etc., are not costed, or intangible assets for that matter, are not costed properly, then the subsequent amortization of the cost of such assets will also be incorrect. Related expenses as well. So pag mali yung asset, yung costing ng asset, mali din yung lalabas na amortization. So those are the common risks related to cost and expenses. Let's now move on to the principal audit objectives in auditing costs and expenses. After discussing the common risks associated with costs and expenses, so these are now the principal audit objectives in auditing costs and expenses. We only have 4 principal audit objectives. The audit objective, addressing rights and obligations, does not apply to costs and expenses. Remember dun sa mga balance sheet accounts na diniscuss natin previously, laging 5 yung audit objective. But for this one, 4 lang. Because of the absence of rights and obligation, of the objective addressing rights and obligation. Nevertheless, all the other principal audit objectives for costs and expenses are the same as their balance sheet counterparts. So we will not discuss each of these anymore. Pareho lang naman, like yung first is yung chine-check niya, yung ina-address niya yung existence or essentially occurrence yung sa first objective, and then yung merong objective that will address completeness and cutoff, etc. So we will not discuss these audit objectives in detail anymore because pareho lang naman sila doon sa accounts payable and accrued expenses and inventories also. So let's now discuss the typical substantive procedures performed on costs and expenses. If you notice, we are moving fast with our training session because, as I said, these accounts essentially result from the balance sheet accounts, which we have discussed how to audit already. For example, certain expenses are tested in conjunction with the audit of the related balance sheet accounts, such as prepaid insurance for insurance expense, fixed assets for depreciation and impairment, accrued interest for interest expense, etc. Accordingly, we will only be discussing a few basic substantive procedures on costs and expenses. 4 audit procedures to be exact. So, 4 na procedures lang ang i-discuss natin because some of the procedures for these accounts are being done or will be done already in the audit of the related balance sheet accounts. However, please note that more audit procedures can be performed on costs and expenses depending on the results of our risk assessments process. But for this training session, we will only be discussing 4 procedures. So having said that, let's briefly discuss each substantive audit procedure. The first one is to recalculate the cost of sales. For these training purposes, we will assume that our client is a retail company. So retail company tayo. Pag manufacturing, ibang case naman yon. But to simplify yung training natin, we will assume that our client is a retail company. The cost of sales of a retail company is linked to inventory. Hence, the audit of the cost of sales should be done simultaneously with the audit of the inventory account. Because both the ending inventory and the beginning inventory balances had been audited in the current and prior year, then the cost of sales can be tested for reasonableness by using the formula opening inventory balance or last year's audited inventory balance plus purchases of inventory made in the current year less ending inventory balance. So the resulting figure that we get from this roll forward analysis should be compared with the balance presented in the books or the amount presented, the cost of sales the amount of cost of sales presented in the general ledger. If no test of controls were performed by the team, purchases during the year should be verified by examining relevant supporting documents on a test basis. If there are significant fluctuations noted during this recomputation that are not within the auditor's expectations, then the auditor should perform further procedures to investigate the variance. So essentially, pag retail company siya, ang tinitingnan na lang natin is yung purchases. We should examine on a test basis the purchases made during the year because the ending inventory balance, ino-audit na natin yan, i-audit natin yan separately, di ba? Yan nga yung we observe for yung ino-observe natin yung physical count ng ending inventory. Tapos yung beginning inventory na audit na rin natin yun last year. So ang kailangan na lang is yung purchases. Yun na lang ang binibigyan natin ng time for in relation to cost. So the next procedure is to select purchase transaction from throughout the year and support proper recording by tracing information from the receiving documents and vendors' invoices through the accounting system for recording in the general ledger. Actually, this transaction can be done simultaneously with the audit of inventory kasi sa test of pricing natin ng inventory, ginagawa natin to. So, pwede siyang isabay doon. So this procedure is discussed in more detail in the auditing of inventory video. This procedure aims to ensure that the recorded purchases are valid, stated at the appropriate amount, and recorded in the proper accounting period. The next item or next procedure is to perform additional analytical review procedures as follows. 1. Compare actual costs and expenses to budgeted amounts and obtain explanations for major or unusual variances, and compare actual costs and expenses to prior year amounts and obtain explanations for major or unusual variances. This is something na we should always be doing. This is something na lagi ko ring hinahanap pag nagtitingin ako ng expenses, yung explanations for significant fluctuations or unusual fluctuations or absence of any fluctuation when expected siya na magkaroon ng fluctuation. Dapat kaya natin itong, in effect, parang kaya natin, when somebody looks at the financial statements and asks, bakit nag-increase, let's say, yung repairs and maintenance, dapat alam natin ang sagot kung bakit nag-increase yung repairs and maintenance. Or let's say, sasabihin niya, bakit nag-increase yung depreciation or yung professional fee, bakit nag-decrease yung expense na to. We should be able to answer kung sino man yung nagtatanong confidently kung bakit nagkaroon ng ganung change sa cost and expenses. So this is something we should always be doing as well. Similar to other accounts, analytic review procedures should also be performed for cost and expenses to identify significant or unusual fluctuations that could result from fraud or error. This is done by comparing amounts of costs and expenses with budgeted amounts or prior year amounts, performing trend analysis, and/or reviewing gross profit ratio for the cost of sales. Any significant variances noted in costs and expenses should be discussed with the client and supporting documents examined. The comparison of costs and expenses should be done on an account-by-account basis. I would like to point out that we should always keep a questioning mind for explanations obtained from the client. That is, we need to substantiate the client's explanations by either inspecting documents or performing predictive testing. So essentially, ang sinasabi natin, hindi dapat natin tinatanggap as is yung mga explanations na binibigay sa atin ng kliyente for the fluctuations in account balances. I remember meron akong dating boss na nakaka-uncover siya talaga ng fraud or error sa financial statements just by doing analytic review. So, ganun ka-importante ang analytic review. We can uncover errors and imbalances and fraud just by looking at the numbers. So, for example, so as I said, dapat sinasubstantiate natin yung explanations ng kliyente. So for example, let's say we noted an increase in salaries and wages from 1,267,898 pesos in the prior year to 1,578 pesos this year for an increase of 311,000 pesos or a 25% increase. So the client told us that the increase is due to the across the board. Ito yung reasons ng kliyente for this increase. There was an across the board increase given to the employees starting in January of this year, and also because daw there were additional employees who were hired this year as well. So yun yung reason niya. When we are given an explanation such as this by the client, we should not just accept the explanation as is. Hindi dapat natin isusulat kaagad natin na ito yung sinabi ng kliyente and then okay na tayo. Hindi ganun ang audit. We should substantiate the client's explanation by predictive testing and or inspecting documents. So, remember yung professional skepticism, dapat lagi natin pinapractice yun. So, dapat lahat ng sagot ng kliyente, may substantiation tayong gagawin. So, how do we substantiate a case like this? So, in this case, we will substantiate the client's explanation through predictive testing. So, to do this, we verify the increase in the number of employees by comparing the prior year and current year employee rosters and inspecting relevant documents for the across-the-board increase. Titingnan natin kung totoo bang nagkaroon ng across-the-board increase, saka ilang tao, kung totoong nag-hire sila ng additional tao, and ilan yung taong in-employ. When verifying, we should always take note of when events occurred. For example, assuming we indeed determined that the number of employees increased by 2. So for this example na-validate naman natin na talagang nag-hire sila ng additional 2 personnel. We should not stop our verification with this information. So, hindi ibig sabihin na verify natin may 2 taong nadagdag. Okay na ulit tayo sa 311,000, 315,000 na difference or increase. We should also take note of the date when the new employees were hired and the amount of monthly salary given to them. The same is true with the across-the-board salary rate increase. We should take note as well when inspecting the relevant document when such an increase was given by the company and by how much the increase was given. Let's say, for example, that we noted through inspection of relevant documents that 2 new employees were hired starting June 1 of this year with a monthly basic salary of 18,000 and that a salary increase of 5% was provided to all employees starting in January of this year. So we can substantiate the client's explanation for the increase in salaries and wages by doing a predictive testing of the increase as follows. So ang predictive testing natin is the increase, not the salaries and wages balance. So we compute for the salaries of the new employees receiving 18,000 per month on June 1 kasi June 1 sila na hire. So we will multiply the number of 2 employees by their basic salary of 18,000 pesos by 7 months or from June 1 to December 31. Let's assume that the company records the 13-month pay separately from the payroll account, kaya 7 months lang kasi hindi 8, hindi natin sinasama yung 13-month pay. This will give us the product of 252,000 pesos. We then compute for the impact of the across-the-board increase in January by multiplying the prior year's audited payroll by 5%, by 5%, which will give us 63,395 pesos. So sabi niya kasi meron daw across-the-board increase from given in January of this year. So ibig sabihin yung nag-increase supposedly kung if all things are equal, so 5% yung last year's salaries and wages plus 5% ang dapat nilang salaries and wages this year. So it will give us the 5% increase is equivalent to 63,395. So we should total the impact of the 2 new employees and the across-the-board increase. So it will give us 315,000. Ang predicted nating increase or the impact of those two as per our computation is 315,395 pesos. And the increase per books earlier was 311,810. So basically, pag kinumpare natin yung predicted increase natin with the noted increase in salaries and wages from prior year to current year of 311,000, meron tayong unaccounted difference pa na 4,385 or just 1%. So in this case, pwede na nating sabihin since na-approximate nung predictive testing natin yung increase in salaries and wages. Therefore, we can really put in our work papers confidently now na ang reason for the increase in salaries and wages is because of the hiring of these 2 employees and the across-the-board increase given by the company in January of the current year. So that's how we substantiate the explanations of our clients. Kung hindi naman siya pwedeng predictive testing, then we examine documents. That's how we substantiate the explanations of our clients. Another audit procedure is to obtain or prepare analysis of professional fees, repairs and maintenance, rent, contributions and donations, key management compensation, payroll, retirement expense, and taxes and licenses. So we examine support for significant individual items of these types of expenses. So we should also scan professional fees to determine the types of outside services by the company that may need further investigation. These are the reasons why we single out these types of expenses. So for professional fees, we try to verify or determine the reasons why the company incurs high professional fees kung ganun yung case. For example, if there were significant legal fees paid by the company, we should understand why. Is the company being represented by these lawyers in ongoing lawsuits? If yes, what are these lawsuits? Should contingent liabilities be recorded? If there are no legal cases, then what are the legal fees for? Kasi sometimes sasabihin ng kliyente, wala namang kaming case. So, ang tanong mo, even sabihin ka ng confirmation ng lawyer, sabihin niya, we did not handle any case for the company. So, dapat we should, pero at the same time, nakita natin ang laki ng professional fee nila paid to lawyers. We have to know kung bakit mayroon silang malaking binayarang fee sa lawyer. Like baka meron nagkakaroon ng corporate restructuring sila na hindi natin alam. So in that case, dapat we have to exert further efforts in understanding kung ano yung corporate structuring na ginagawa nila or kung ano yung ina-ask nilang service from the lawyers. Or kung meron mga consultancy fees with other let's say auditing firms, dapat inaalam din natin kung anong service yung binibigay ng auditing firm na yon. Kasi baka related din yun. Let's say mayroon pala silang pinaplano ng mga bond offering or IPO na hindi nila nabanggit sa atin. So in those cases, malalaman natin. Kasi those types of transactions can impact our opinion as well. Kasi kung merong bond offering, ibig sabihin magre-raise sila ng capital. Kung magre-raise sila ng capital, ibig bang sabihin may pressure, kailangan malaman natin may pressure ba, actually hindi dapat nating malaman, pero kasi kung may bond offering sila, ibig sabihin may pressure for them to present better results of operations. Kasi sino naman ang bibili ng bonds nila or mag-a-avail ng bonds nila, kung mag-acquire ng bonds nila, kung pangit naman ang results of operation. So, ibig sabihin, may pressure for the company to present better results of operations. And that will impact our audit kasi baka merong manipulation palang ginagawa sa libro ng company for them to be able to present these better results of operations for the planned bond offering in the future. So dapat tinitingnan nating mabuti ang professional fees. Now, for repairs and maintenance, as mentioned during the training session for fixed assets, repairs and maintenance should be reviewed for the amounts that should be capitalized to fixed assets, but which the company erroneously charged to the repairs and maintenance account. Ito naman tinitingnan lang natin kung baka mayroong mga naka-charge sa repairs and maintenance na capitalizable sa fixed assets. For lease agreements, we should examine and determine the rent expense to properly recognize that the let me backtrack. For rent expense, we should examine lease agreements to ensure that the rent expense recognized in the books are properly recorded in the proper accounting period and at the appropriate amounts. And in accordance with yung PFRS 16 kung full PFRS siya. For contributions and donations in the Philippines, for contributions and donations to be allowed as a deductible expense for tax purposes, a certification of donation is needed. Accordingly, we should ensure that our clients have the certification for the BIR to allow the donation or contribution to be a deductible expense for tax purposes. Key management compensation, payroll, and retirement expense can be used as sources of fraud as well by, for example, having ghost employees or incorrect computation of salary. So palagi nating tinetest, ang salaries and wages actually is a high-risk expense. It is one of those rare expenses na lagi nating or madalas na kinaklasify as high risk because of the possibility of ghost employees saka overstated na salaries and wages. So we should always give particular attention to these types of expenses. So yung anything related to compensation. Finally, taxes and licenses should be reviewed also for unusual tax payments. For example, a company paying real property tax when they don't have real property should alert auditors for possible fraud or errors. Nagkaroon na ako ng ganitong kliyente before. Nagkaroon sila ng i-charge nila to taxes and licenses, yung isang real property tax. Wala naman silang asset or activity na subject to real property tax. Actually, nagkamali sila kasi yung real property tax nung related party nila na ni-record nila sa libro nila. But what I'm saying is things like that happen sa taxes and licenses. Plus, of course, because of the requirements of the BIR through RR 15-2010. So, kailangan talagang tingnan natin yung taxes and licenses account. The last audit procedure we will discuss about costs and expenses is to test the reasonableness of depreciation, rent, payroll, and other expenses that allow for recalculations based on their nature. So these are the expenses that we can do predictive testing on. Certain amounts of costs and expenses, due to their nature and how they are incurred, are recorded in the books and recorded in the books can be predicted as to how much they should be at the end of a particular period because they involve fixed amounts that are regularly incurred. In this regard, instead of examining source documents, we can consider testing for the reasonableness of the amount recorded in the books. So test of reasonableness is an auditing technique that seeks to validate accounting events or transactions through recalculations and expectations. Others calls this test of reasonableness predictive testing. Because in performing this procedure, we try to predict how much the amount of an account should be. Usual expense accounts that are subjected to the test of reasonableness when material in amount are rent, interest, depreciation, and payroll. Sample test of reasonableness for depreciation is presented and discussed in the training for auditing fixed assets. So yung depreciation, hindi na natin i-discuss. Please note that when we do a test of reasonableness or predictive testing, we should always know the margin of difference we can accept to conclude that the amount of expense is still reasonable or not anymore. Any amount beyond this margin of difference will require further investigation or audit procedure for us, from us. So, ibig sabihin, pag nagpe-predictive testing tayo, dapat alam natin yung margin of error or margin of difference na pwede nating tanggapin na to conclude na fairly presented pa rin yung balance. Remember, predictive testing and test of reasonableness is, as the terms imply, ano lang siya, estimates lang yung ginagamit natin. So, most likely, most of the time, may difference na lumalabas sa recalculations natin. Also, I would like to point out that the basis we use in predictive testing should have been verified by us first. In this regard, other auditing procedures, such as inspection of documents, will need to be performed on the base amounts first before we can use them in our predictive testing. Let's take, for example, depreciation. For this expense, we need to verify the correctness or fairness of the fixed assets cost first before we do the depreciation testing. For rent, we need to examine the covering lease agreements first and use the information on such lease agreements in performing the test of reasonableness of the rent expense or rent income of the company. So always remember the old computing concept of garbage in, garbage out. So nonsense na input data produces garbage output as well. So garbage input data results in or produces garbage output data. So kung mali yung base natin, mali rin yung predictive testing, ang kalalabasan ng predictive testing natin. So dapat, even for insurance, dapat tinetest muna natin kung tama yung base amount na gagamitin natin for predictive testing. Kasi for all we know, mali yung cost na tinetest natin or ina-amortize natin. So to finish this training session, let's answer the following question very quickly. Based on the auditor's examination of the company's trial balance, they noted an interest expense account amounting to 180,790. However, when looking at the statement of the financial position, the auditor did not note any loans payable at the end of the prior year and the end of the current year. The client insisted, however, that the interest expense is valid. Could the client be right? So wala ka namang nakitang loans payable sa beginning, wala ka ring nakitang loans payable sa end, and yet meron siyang interest expense, and according to the client, those interest expense are related to loans payable. Is it possible? Pwede bang mangyari yung sinasabi ng client na may interest expense pero walang outstanding loans payable? The answer to this is yes, it is possible. The interest expense could still be valid despite the inexistent loan payable balance at the end of the prior and current years. This is because the client could have gotten short-term loans or loans during the year, which they also fully paid before the end of the year. The auditor, however, should verify whether there were indeed loans that were obtained and fully settled during the year by inspecting appropriate audit evidence. So, pwede siyang mangyari kasi pwedeng yung client, nag-obtain siya ng loans during the year, binayaran din niya during the year. So, and I know of a client na gumagawa talaga nito, nag-obtain lang siya ng mga 3 months na loans, na short-term loans, and then babayaran din niya kaagad. So, meron siyang interest expense and yet, wala siyang loans payable na makikita sa financial statements as at December 31 every year. So, but in cases like this, dapat i-test pa rin natin yung reasonableness by looking at the obtained loans during the year and then verify kung reasonable yung interest na ni-record niya based sa mga loans na inobtain niya during the year and yung mga interest din na binayaran niya sa bangko during the year. So actually, that's it for accounts payable and accrued expenses and costs and expenses. If kung meron kayong question, feel free to ask. May questions ba? Questions from participants. Sa bagay, wrong send. Question testing among cost and what is the importance as accounts payable? What is the importance as accounts payable? What are you? Okay. What is the importance as accounts payable? I'm not really sure what is the question. What is the importance as accounts payable? Hindi ko alam kung ano yung question sa first. I don't know what you mean by what is the importance of accounts payable, but what are the effective substantive testing method for accounts payable? Again, as I said earlier, for an effective substantive testing procedure, for a substantive testing procedure to be assessed as effective, that substantive testing procedure should be able to address or respond to the risk identified by the team during the planning phase of the audit for the accrued and expense account balance. So as I said, as I keep on saying, kapag mali yung risk assessment process natin during the substantive testing, during the planning phase of the audit, therefore, yung substantive procedures na ita-tailor natin for those risks, magiging mali rin, magiging ineffective din kasi hindi niya na a-address yung mga risks na na-identify during the planning phase. Or pwede rin kasi na tama nga yung risk assessment na ginawa during the planning phase of the audit, and yet yung substantive audit procedures na ginawa, hindi naman niya na-address yung substantive the risk identified. So, in other words, para maging effective ang substantive testing procedure, not just for accounts payable, but for all other accounts, dapat yung procedures na gagawin natin are designed specifically and tailor-made specifically to address all the risks correctly identified during the planning phase of the audit. So, very important yung planning phase, yung identification ng risk during the planning phase of the audit. Kasi parang ano rin yan, garbage in, garbage out. So kung garbage ang planning phase mo, lalabas most likely ang substantive audit procedures mo na i-design for those risks, garbage din. So, pero at the same time, pwede rin namang maayos yung planning phase, pero garbage pa rin yung substantive procedure natin kasi hindi natin kinostomize doon sa needs ng client natin. Remember, all these substantive procedures that we discuss, generic. Parang ito yung usual, sabi ko nga, typical procedures, but it doesn't follow na lahat ito would be effective for your clients. Kasi nga, baka iba yung mga risk na na-identify or baka yung mga procedures na to may not be able to address the risk identified for your particular client. Kaya nga sabi ko, pwedeng yung yung mga diniscuss nating procedures, pwede siyang mabawasan, pwede siyang madagdagan, pwedeng lahat yung kailangan yung gawin. Depende yon doon sa risk assessment process na ginawa ng team during the planning phase. So yun ang pinaka-importante actually, yung risk assessment process during the planning phase. Kasi yung substantive procedure, susunod lang siya doon sa risk assessment process. So kung hindi effective yung risk assessment process mo, kahit anong gawin mong procedure, substantive procedure ang gawin mo, pwede siyang effective, pero pwede maging inefficient yung audit kasi ginawa mo lahat ng procedures, whereas baka kailangan 3, 2 or 4 lang na procedures pa lang kailangan mo kasi ito lang naman yung risk doon sa client na ino-audit mo. I hope that's clear. What else? If there are long outstanding accrual expense on the books po, can we suggest? Okay, for long outstanding accrual expenses, ang dapat nating sabihan kagad yung client, they have to investigate those accrued expenses. Kasi kung sila mismo, sila kasi ang nakakaalam talaga kung ano yung composition noon. Pero kasi kung sila mismo, hindi nila alam yung composition, therefore, dapat mag-exert sila ng effort na alamin kung ano yung composition na yun, kung valid pa ba yun or hindi na. Kasi, dapat, ang requirement kasi, di ba, ng standard is dapat, fairly presented yung liability. Hindi naman sinabing dapat conservative ka, hindi naman ganun ang sinasabi ng standard. Dapat fairly presented. So, pwedeng magkaroon talaga ng overstatement sa liability. Therefore, ang dapat liability, kung ano lang yung dapat, kung ano lang yung valid, dapat yun lang yung nasa libro. So, although, di ba maraming clients sinasabi, let's retain those liabilities kasi baka parang buffer, di ba sinasabi ng iba, gawin nating buffer for baka meron kasing mag-claim, tapos yan ang gagamitin nating parang yan ang nakabook na siya as is kasi may buffer tayo. Pero hindi kasi dapat ganun. So, for long outstanding liabilities, dapat sinasabihan natin yung client for them to investigate and clear those liabilities, those long outstanding liabilities. Tapos, kung kaya natin, sabihin natin, o i-suggest na rin natin, i-write off nila yung mga invalid obligations. Pero silang dapat na gumawa na hindi tayo pwede magsabi na i-write off natin tong long outstanding kasi hindi natin alam kasi yung history, no, yung mga documents supporting those liabilities. So, dapat silang mag-initiate nun. Ang pwede lang natin sabihin is for them to clear those liabilities and make sure na, tapos kung hindi natin ma-validate, let's say walang mga documents, then that is something na dapat tinitingnan natin kung ano yung impact sa audit opinion natin. Masyado, yung bang, because hindi natin ma-audit, hindi natin ma-examine ng tama, competently, yung balance, should we, and the client couldn't give us then the supporting documents or proof na valid yung mga documents na yun, then that is something that we should consider qualifying our opinion for. Pero syempre, depende yon sa circumstances ng mga clients natin. So, ang first step natin is to ask the client to clean up the long outstanding payables.